Wow, it looks like standing room only here. I am Michael Hoffman. I am the chairman of the Academy, and delighted to be here in this special occasion. As you know, twice a year we introduce our new class of fellows, and it gives us a great pleasure to be here to introduce the fall class of this year, 2014. I just want to acknowledge we have a very illustrious audience here, none more so than our guest speaker this evening, Professor Runnicles, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. We have, of course, almost all of our new fellows. One or two couldn't be here, but most are, and they will all be speaking to us in the course of the evening. The Fellows program in our organization is led by the Dean of Fellows, and I wanted to introduce Wolf Schaefer. Wolf, could you stand? Wolf is, thank you, is the Dean of the Fellows program at the Academy, having succeeded Pamela Rosenberg, whom I see there sitting in the next row, who did such a fabulous job here over a number of years, and in fact has instrumental in bringing many excellent classes of fellows to the Academy. And a very hard act to follow, but Wolf will try, and is certainly well suited to do so. Professor Wolf Schaefer is a historian who has, before taking on this role, been involved as in the international academic and services role at New York University at Stony Brook, and as such has had to engage, I'm sure, with lots of different faculty from all sorts of different fields of study. And that is really what this Fellows program is about, is having an opportunity to bring on board and work with people from all sorts of backgrounds particularly in the arts and the humanities, but as well as integrating with activities that are going on in our Distinguished Visitors programs, which is more focused on public policy. So, Wolf, welcome here, and we look forward to your leadership of this program. So, without further ado, I want to hand over to Gary Smith, who is obviously you all well known to you all. Who has been an executive director over the better part of the last 20 years, but never grows old, and is always full of vibrancy and also interesting initiatives. So Gary is going to introduce our program for this evening, and looking very much forward to hearing about and from the new fellows. Gary.
Where's my cane? You don't make me feel younger. No, good evening. This is I guess it's the 33rd time I've stood up here, and it's a very special evening. It's one of the it's really a highlight or the highlight of each quarter when the fellows, in a kind of intellectual temptresses present themselves to you in brevity, so that after this is over, you can spend many hours getting to know each other and then introduce them to Berlin. So it was 20 years ago, before I was here, before the Academy existed, but we had the United States had a remarkable ambassador, Richard Holbrooke. He was here for 12 months. And those 12 months, actually, he was based in Bonn, but this was his favorite city for many reasons. And he understood that 5 years after the Berlin Wall had fallen, that our relationship would change fundamentally, because Richard Holbrooke was, if anything, a great strategic mind, certainly the most impressive in the world of diplomacy that I've ever encountered. And he understood that with the departure of hundreds of thousands of Americans who had lived here and interacted with Germans, the Berlin Brigade and the U.S. troops throughout the country, and that also these personal relationships would be absent. And diplomatic relationships also are often nourished from personal relationships. So It was his idea to found an American Academy in Berlin. It was conceived of a little bit differently than it turned out. We think it turned out pretty well, so 20 years ago, actually a week ago, there was a torchlight parade. There was a Zapfenstreich. There was a torchlight parade throughout Berlin, and the next day there was a CEO conference. Holbrooke and Kissinger, Richard von Weizsäcker were chairing it, and they announced the founding of the American Academy in Berlin. Holbrooke went back to Washington. He then did the Dayton Accords. He created peace in the Balkans, came back in 1997, and began to figure out how he was going to fulfill this promise, which he did in really glorious ways. And it's thanks to many of you in this room who, some of you were here at the very beginning, whereas, well, anyway, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but some of you were here and helped pick out the tile in the bathrooms and the carpets, and some of you saw that we had, for the first and last time, we had truffles at our reception, but the food hasn't gotten any worse, and it's thanks above all to the trustees. I'm very happy that, Michael, you've come from London to introduce the evening. There you are. And trustees who've been here. Also, the only trustee that was here before I was here is Michael Geeson, and who has taken care of our every kind of imaginable legal complication since the very beginning, and been a great Berlin trustee. And one of our other great Berlin trustees is Volker Schlorendorf, who's here somewhere, and who just made a little film about the Academy, which we're also very happy about. But I could actually talk about many of you. I do want to mention our senior counselors, because these are people who aren't trustees but basically do more work. They're always there and available to us. That's Bernhard van der Planitz, that's Karen and Joram Roth, that's, oh my God, of course it's Richard Gowell, and I think those are the people here tonight. And there are many other people that I could greet. I want to say hello to Leonard Barkin. It's always great to see an alum in the audience who continues to help us. And then my favorite guest in the audience is someone I had the privilege of working with for a number of years. That's Pamela Rosenberg. So welcome again. But I could speak about many of you. In any case, the Academy, given the announcement in '94, it was quite extraordinary that already this building renovated opened its doors in the fall of 1998 with Arthur Miller, Charlie Williams, Kendall Thomas, a blues band, Gail Tufts, and all sorts of things. And since that time, the Academy's become home to, I guess, over 400 fellows, just short-term visitors, and then many other lecturers. They're always coming back to Berlin. George Packer's coming next week. Our historian from last year, Tara Zara, is the 6th Academy alum to win the MacArthur Prize, whatever that means. And Alex Ross even wrote about Walter Benjamin this week's issue of The New Yorker. So what else needs to be said? Thank you also, Pamela, for bringing Donald Runnicles to the Academy. Donald Runnicles is, you all know he's really an American. I mean, he was at San Francisco for almost 2 decades, also working with Pamela, creating a number of historic productions, conducted in Atlanta for many years, and continues to run the Grand Tetons Festival every summer. And of course, from my amateur point of view, he's transformed the Deutsche Oper, the orchestra, the program, and it's quite a program. I have it written down somewhere. I think you do more than 200 performances a year? Not personally, no. Okay, fine. Well, we're disappointed then. But you're responsible for a company that produces an average of 25 productions and more than 200 performances, of which you certainly conduct more than the GMD in Dresden, for example. So we're very grateful to that. And for your recording of Wagner arias with Jonas Kaufmann and Deutsche Oper, which won the Decca Classic, which won the Gramophone Prize for the Best Vocal Recording last year, among other things. So I want to greet you, and we're looking forward to hear what you have to say. Then each fellow will get up and in exemplary brevity and humor and erudition will convey what they're doing here. And I do want to say that it's a pretty extraordinary class, and we're very proud. You have no idea what we go through to get to this point. I mean, we have an exceptional committee. We recruit many applications. They're vetted many times, debated in New York, and we've already seen that this class has a special quality and timbre, and you'll see it tonight. So thank you very much.
A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In stark contrast to Gary, who has stood here 33 times, I am standing here for the very first time. And I can only say, like any conductor who wishes to make an impact on his or her orchestra or institution, you study your orchestra. You study those people with whom you are working. And having studied tonight's incredible list of new fellows to this venerable and storied institution, I have no idea why I'm standing here, quite frankly. I am humbled, genuinely honored, and very thrilled, and this has a great deal to do, Gary, thank you, Pamela, thank you, to do with the relationship that we have nurtured over many, many years on both sides of the pond, in old Europe and new Europe, and well, let's not even go there. It really is a great honor to stand here. I come with an interesting pedigree. I am an honorary San Franciscan. I do, though, however, and some of you may discern that in my weird accent. I come originally from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I will not be taking any questions this evening, ladies and gentlemen, in any form. I came from Edinburgh to Europe, where my apprenticeship as a pianist. I'm not going to take any questions, I'm really not. Although Mel Gibson is one of my favorite actors. I came by way of Europe to America and to San Francisco, where Adele, my wife, and I have lived almost 20 years. And when the call came from Berlin to potentially become the musical leader of the Deutsche Oper Berlin, a lot of soul searching, because after San Francisco, any of you, ladies and gentlemen, who have been in that city or lived in that city, that's an incredibly hard city to follow. It's an incredibly hard city for any other city to live up to, and a lot of soul searching, but we decided that we would indeed embrace Berlin. It's one of the weirder parts of my personal story. I'm sure many of us, or perhaps you can empathize with Berlin when one doesn't know this city, particularly coming from out with Berlin. Many of us know it, quite frankly, through black and white film. You imagine that this is going to be this black and white city on some level, whether it was footage before the war, during the war, after the war. And I'm sure many of you have, and amongst a number of the fellows, you may have flown into Berlin Tegel, and have thought 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute before actually landing here, there's been some terrible mistake. This cannot possibly be Berlin, because all you see are woods and lakes. You see the color green, you see the color blue. And for me, that is something of a metaphor for what we, Adele and I, and our children have come to love about this remarkable city. I have the privilege of working in all the major cities of the world. That comes along with the territory, that working with the big orchestras or the big opera companies. They happen to be in New York, they happen to be in Paris, they happen to be in San Francisco, London, etc., etc. And I've had a chance really to be in many of these large cities. And I can only say now that we've lived in Berlin. We moved here in 2011. This is our third year here. All 4 children are now in the Nelson Mandela Schule. We are quite etabliert. We can only say this has to be perhaps the most remarkable city in the world. The fact that I even just said that, bearing in mind what we may hear this evening about all of those illustrious fellows who go far, far deeper than I could ever possibly go in terms of historical, social, cultural history, I would nonetheless say that this city clearly represents, and I say this as a Scot, as I remain still a Brit, one looks upon this city. My father could not fathom in 1979 when, as a young man, I told him, I'm moving, Dad, to Germany because that's my future. That's where the great opera is. That's where the great composers began. It's the cradle of our civilization on some level. And where my father said to me, Donald, I cannot believe I spent so many years fighting that country. And it was very shortly after I actually moved to Germany, my father came to visit me, and he looked somewhat sheepish as he said to me, they're just like us. And I say that in no way to be blasé or patronizing or condescending, but to be in this phenomenal city with its incredible history, with its dark history, dark history, and yet with its phenomenal present and exciting future. On every level, I feel as if this, and I experienced this, the macrocosm is Berlin, the microcosm perhaps for me is the Deutsche Oper Berlin. We have an ensemble, resident singers who work with us, about 34 singers. And they come from Australia, they come from America, they come from Great Britain, they come from all over. And as I say, this for me is this microcosm in the macrocosm which represents this remarkable city, a city that continually reinvents itself, that embraces in coming to terms with, and once again, I don't even feel I can even finish that sentence, because many of you can speak more eloquently to this city and its history. But what I do know is, as an honorary San Franciscan, as a Scot, as a world traveler, to be at the helm of one of the most illustrious opera companies in the world is a great privilege, not only because it is great opera, it's something for me, coming from San Francisco, where we would have 9 or 10 new productions a year. Each and every production was new. You did it 5 or 6 times, and then it was gone. The Deutsche Oper Berlin has 34, 35 different productions that are done every year. 200 performances. It's a culture shock coming from America to here, in the best possible way. It's a culture shock to be standing in a queue, buying some flowers for whatever occasion it was, standing behind 2 people who were having this heated debate with the person who was selling flowers about the fact that they had just been to the Komische Oper and they'd just seen Carmen, and they had absolutely no idea what the director was trying to achieve. Now, I challenge most of you, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you come from, to find that queue in a flower shop somewhere else where you will hear, where you will witness, where you will overhear culture in its widest sense. And this is not just about opera. This is the holistic experience that is this country, not just Berlin, where culture in its widest sense is embraced on an absolute daily basis, where, as we all know, it is most clearly subsidized by a government that is still very much adamant about the fact that great culture is a birthright. It is not a matter of, can I afford to go to that? Can I afford to go to that? It is an area where, and I will leave this up to far more illustrious minds than mine to discuss this about just culture around the world and how it's embraced, and coming from America, experiencing right this very minute, just before I got here, phone calls in Atlanta, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, strife there, a lockout, and it's all about, surprise, surprise, it's all about money. And while that in and of itself is a very sad situation, which I'm sure will be resolved well, it reminds me, and should remind all of us here, that we are not fighting, I should say culturally, or certainly with museums, opera, art galleries, orchestras, we're not necessarily yet fighting for that money to create all of this. It's there because many, very many enlightened people realize that it is and should be a birthright. With that, call me what you like, whether I'm a Scot who lives in Berlin or an honorary San Franciscan after 20 years who, along with Adele and our children, embraced the city as the greatest city in the world. I can only say on behalf, I hope, of many who are in this room tonight, to each and every one of the new fellows, I am genuinely humbled to be standing here, and welcome to this poor but sexy city. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Hillel Schwartz. And first of all, I would like to welcome all of you here this evening as warmly as I and all of the other fellows and their spouses and children have been welcomed by the Academy already. Indeed, for me, I feel most fortunate. As an independent scholar, I am more accustomed to the life in a mobile home than in a modest villa on the Wannsee. I do cultural history. I co-direct a business dedicated to medical case management. I collaborate in the translation of Korean poetry. And I work in public arts and humanities projects as a consultant, as, for example, I did with the theme pavilion for Expo 2000 in Hanover called The Future of the Past. My current project here at the Academy for the fall will be dedicated to the study of the changing nature and notions and experience of emergency across the Atlantic ecumene during and after the late 18th century through to the 21st century. In a scholarly vein, this project builds upon my prior work on the history of apocalypticism and prophecy, the history of the ends of centuries and the ends of worlds far more millennial, on the history of technology and on the contours of the changing motion of the human body, and not least on the history of noise, including the history of sirens and alarms. On a professional note, my interest in emergency stems from work I did with the Millennium Institute in the 1990s on issues of global sustainability, as well as on my current work with people, ordinary people, facing terrible medical emergencies and very complex medical problems. On a personal note, the background for my work on emergency comes from 30 years of work as a volunteer organizing a local food pantry, and finally, from a habit, if not also an obsession, with putting together, maintaining, and repairing emergency survival kits in the event of an earthquake, a tsunami, or a forest fire. From all of this, you may gather that I come from California. Which is correct. From a beach town, indeed, in Southern California, which until quite recently claimed to be the flower capital of the world, if not the universe.
Good evening. I'm really very happy to be here. My name is Beatriz Colomina. I'm professor of architecture at Princeton University, and of course a fellow here. I'm really very happy to be in this wonderful incubator of ideas. On our first day here, in a meeting with the fellows, Wolf told us that if we were to do here what we had planned to do, then the academy will have failed. And of course, I don't want the academy to fail. And for a few days, I started thinking about what this mysterious statement could mean. And eventually, I came to the realization that he was completely right, that I should actually do something that made sense of me being here in this particular place and in this time and with this wonderful group of colleagues. So I changed my topic to X-ray architecture. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I have to put my glasses. So what is the story with X-ray architecture? Modern architecture, which as you know was launched in the 1920s by an international group of architects, by the way, many of them Germans, and Berlin really an incredibly crucial acupuncture point, has been understood in architectural history in terms of functional efficiency, new materials like iron, glass, reinforced concrete, new technologies of construction, and the machine aesthetics. In contrast, the hypothesis of the work that I'm going to develop here is that the architecture of the early 20th century was shaped by the dominant obsession, medical obsession, by the way, of its time, which is tuberculosis. In fact, modern architecture cannot be understood outside tuberculosis, and this is the paradoxical thing. This has been studied, obviously. Literature has studied tuberculosis, art, even music, but architecture is blind to this simple fact that the principles of modern architecture seem to be taken straight out of a medical book on the disease. A year before, the German microbiologist Robert Koch discovered the tuberculous bacillus in 1882, a standard medical book on the disease listed as the causes unfavorable climate, sedentary indoor life, defective ventilation, and deficiency of light. It took a very long time for these notions to lose credibility, as Susan Sontag wrote in that beautiful book, Illness as Metaphor. The TB patient was thought to be helped, even cured, by a change in environment. There was a notion that the TB was a wet disease, a disease of the humid and dank cities, and that the inside of the body itself had become wet and had to be dried out. Modern architects offer health by providing exactly such a change of environment. 19th century architecture was all of a sudden demonized as unhealthy, and sun, light, ventilation, exercise, roof terrace, hygiene, and whiteness were offered as means to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. In other words, the publicity campaign of modern architecture was organized around contemporary beliefs about tuberculosis and fears of the disease. For example, Le Corbusier, in one of his most famous books, dismisses what he calls the natural ground as dispenser, in his work, of rheumatism and tuberculosis, and declares to be the enemy of man. He insists in the same way to detach the house with the help of pilotis. Pilotis are these very narrow, very thin columns from what he calls the wet, humid ground where the seas breathe, and he insists also on using the roof as garden for sunbathing and exercise. Of course, nobody seemed to know anything about skin cancer at that point, but that will be another story. Architectural discourse has, of course, from the beginning associated body and building. You may very well remember the image of the Vitruvian man of Leonardo da Vinci depicting the correlation between the ideal human proportions with the ideal proportions of a building, according to the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. But the hypothesis of this research is that the body that architectural discourse describes is actually the medical body, a body that is reconstructed by each new theory of health. To stay with Leonardo, for example, in his work you can see sections of architectural interiors, even in the same page, in which he has anatomical drawings. He understood the interior of the brain and of the womb, as in architectural terms, as enclosures whose envelope have to be cut through to reveal their secrets. As medical representations changed, so did architectural representation, and in the 20th century it was precisely the widespread use of X-ray that made a new way of thinking about architecture possible. Just as the X-ray exposes the inside of the body to the public eye, modern buildings all of a sudden decide that they also have to expose their interior. Modern buildings started even to look like medical images. Mies van der Rohe, for example, describes his project of the glass skyscraper of 1922 as a skin and bones architecture, and renders it as if you were seeing the building through an X-ray machine. And of course, Mies is not alone. Books of modern architecture are full of X-rays. It's like books of X-rays. Today, of course, there are new instruments of medical diagnosis, new systems of representation, and we can already see their effects on architecture. The CAT scan, for example, may be very well for the late 20th century generation of architects, as important as the X-ray was for the architects in the early decades of the century. In fact, the CAT scan, as you probably know, is simply many X-rays compiled by a computer to generate a cross-sectional view and three-dimensional images of the body's internal organs. The way doctors look and analyze a body today, with their 3D modeling, is in fact the same way that architects look and analyze buildings. Design, again, is a form of surgery. So I can, of course, think of a better place to complete this book than here in Wannsee, with all the TB sanatoria around the lake, as I certainly recently found out, as if it were some kind of magic mountain of Berlin. I'm also, of course, looking forward to the cross-contamination of ideas that has already started here with Amonoar Group, the Academy, as if this was kind of a sanatorium with favorite writers in every room. I'm very happy to be a patient here. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Never follow, note to self, never follow a scholar with a sound machine. I'm so honored to be here. I'd like to thank this institution's extraordinary staff. They've made us feel welcome. They've made it easy to work. I'm here with my wife and children, and as my daughters become experts on the S-Bahn and U-Bahn and connoisseurs of graffiti and bailing out their monolingual parents, ordering in German, it makes me think that Mr. Holbrook's vision for this place is even more fully realized in them when they return home and reimagine their country after their experiences here. I am a fiction writer. So unlike my esteemed colleagues, I just make stuff up. I'd go so far as to say I know nothing comparatively, but Wolf told me not to say that. I'm working on a novel called Playworld, and I thought the best way to introduce what I'm doing is to read you the first chapter, which is very short. Takes about 3 minutes. Playworld. In the fall of 1980, when I was 13, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shaw fell in love with me. She was 36, a mother of 2, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. 2 decades later, when I finally told my mother about this, we were taking a walk on the beach. She stopped, stunned, and said, "But she was such an ugly woman." The remark wasn't as petty as it sounds, but closer to objective fact, which didn't mean I ever considered Naomi to be bad-looking. If I was aware of it then, it neither repulsed nor affected my feelings for her. It was just a thing I took for granted, like the color of her hair. This was one of her more remarkable, memorable attributes, wiry and ashen. It had the shadings, but not the shimmer of pigeon's feathers. Naomi kept it long, so that it fell past her shoulders, a witch's width, whose texture was dry as tinder and springy as brush. I knew it by touch, for my face was often buried in it. Only later did I wonder if she considered herself unattractive, because she always wore Porsche sunglasses, the gold frames so large they looked more like a visor with blue-tinted prescription lenses. When we were driving together, which was often that year, she'd allow these to slide down her nose and look at me over their bridge like a librarian. She might have considered this pose winning, but was more likely to see me better. Her mouth hung open. Her teeth were uneven, especially her lower ones, and her tongue, pressing against them, brined in her spittle, which always tasted of coffee. The next thing I recall about Naomi is her car. It was a silver Mercedes sedan, 300 SD, along with turbo diesel nickel-plated on the back that rattled like a bus while idling, but made a deep hum when it drove. The interior, enormous in my mind's eye, was tricked out with glossy wood paneling and white leather, back seats so wide and legroom so ample, it made the driver appear to be far away. It was in this car that Naomi and I talked most often. We'd park, and then she'd lean across the armrests to press her cheek to mine, and I'd sometimes allow her to kiss me. Other times, we'd move to the back, lying there while Naomi nuzzled my neck. I'd stare at the ceiling's dotted insulation until the pattern seemed to detach and then drift like a starry sky. This car was her prized possession, and like many commuters, she turned the machine into an extension of her body. Her left thumb lightly hooked the wheel at 8 o'clock when traffic was moving, her fingertips sliding to 11 when it was slow. She liked to sit slightly reclined. Her right elbow propped on the rest, her hand spread on her inner thigh, though after she lost her pinky that summer, and even after being fitted with a prosthesis, she kept it tucked away. I worried you'd think it was disgusting, she said, the digit sandwiched between the bucket seat and her hip. Not at all. She'd bought herself a diamond ring to hide the seam, and for the most part, the likeness was uncanny, but at certain angles, you could tell the silicone was rubbery, the cuticles lined too smooth, the nails pale crescent, too creamy to match the others, like my father's fake teeth, which he often left lying around our apartment. I was fascinated by it, though my curiosity wasn't morbid. I was a child actor, you see, a student of all forms of dissembling, and had long ago found my greatest subject to be adults. Thank you.
As Michael Hoffman already told you, a couple of our fellows cannot be here tonight. So please allow me to read about the project that Monica Black has. Monica Black is a social and cultural historian. She's working on a book about West Germany in the years after 1945, the period after Nazism, after the human and moral catastrophe of the Holocaust, after monumental defeat in World War II, in the midst of military occupation, and in which people continually face the possibility of renewed war, indeed nuclear annihilation. For Monica, this moment was as complex and fraught as almost any in European history. Her book deals with mostly unknown people and events and tries to reconstruct the meaning and impact of a number of uncanny phenomena. Phenomena unknown, often even to specialists in German cultural and social history. The people and phenomena she's writing about include a peripatetic healer, Bruno Gröning, who claimed to channel divine power to cure the sick, an alarming cluster of witchcraft accusations, some of which led to higher profile court cases, prophecies of the end of the world, a trial to ban magic books, and a spate of exorcisms. She says about herself, "I tend to gravitate towards historical ephemera, the fine-grained and hard-to-reconstruct operations of everyday life, the dark corners of history and events that might at first glance appear too odd or too singular to be of much interest. It's my basic conviction about history that those things that seem to have no history or that somehow resist being integrated into the mainstream of historical interpretation are very likely to yield the most interesting and challenging questions. I'm interested, she says, in the unexpected phenomena about which I'm writing for these reasons, but also because these phenomena and the people who created them have been largely forgotten. When something makes a discernible impact over a number of years and then drops right out of history and memory, that is, of course, a historical fact itself and potentially a very enlightening. We think of the 20th century as a century of science and imagine that somehow by the 1950s, exorcists and witch doctors would no longer feature in our collective cultural landscape. This is an illusion. Exorcists and witch doctors have histories too. They take different forms and mean different things in different moments. Nor would it be correct, in my view, to juxtapose the kinds of phenomena about which I'm writing against science and rationality. They had their own rationality, their own logic. And in West Germany, in the 1950s, they intersected not only with science, but also with the state, the law, the medical profession, and official religion in unexpected ways. Ultimately, the point of Monica's project is not to show the presence of the irrational or the unmodern in the middle of the 20th century, but rather to meditate on what the striking phenomena with which she deals in her book, what they meant in society wrestling with competing claims to moral truth in a moment of profound disillusionism.
Guten Abend. My name is Daniel Eisenberg. I'm a filmmaker from Chicago and a professor of film, video, new media, and animation at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I want to thank the Academy and its staff for this amazing opportunity to live and work in Berlin, a place that's become my second city, and where I feel much of my most important work has been done and fully received. I also want to acknowledge our current group of fellows who have, in 3 short weeks, become fast friends and lively interlocutors. So thank you all. It's quite a special group of people. We've been asked to present a quick sketch of our work here, and without images, that's difficult for a filmmaker. But I hope I'll be able to entice you to return later when it's cold, dark, and rainy, and when looking at images from warmer places makes even more sense. As technology continues to disrupt so many social and economic formations, our relationship to every object we encounter is transformed. Things now present a new register of unstable meanings. why we want something, what it means to us, how its value is established. All these questions are up for grabs. And now we all know everything is made elsewhere, someplace across the planet, by the invisible women, men, and children whose lives can only be imagined. My Academy project, The Unstable Object, is a series of 3 feature-length films motivated by some of these simple questions and a few others. What are the working days like for those who make the things around us? How do these objects connect us? What kinds of exchanges take place through the object itself? I've completed the first film in this series consisting of 3 factories. The first factory, located in Dresden's Cultural District, is a high-tech luxury automobile factory where customers come to watch their cars being made by hand, as do tourists peering through the dividing glass. The manufacturing process is slowed down so that it could be seen and savored. Here, labor is valued and in some important ways consumed through its visibility. In counterpoint to this space is the second factory in Chicago, where blind and sight-impaired workers produce wall clocks for federal office buildings. There, the object that they produce is thoroughly touched by the workers, but remains unseen by them. While those who use these clocks every day will never touch the object, but only see it. A sensual exchange takes place through the object itself. The third factory in this series, located in a stone barn outside Istanbul, is a cymbal factory that uses 500-year-old technology. As workers hammer the cymbals, they produce rhythmic and deafening sound, a kind of extraordinary music of their own. Although these 2 are luxury products, the factory deliberately uses ancient technology to create added value. These 3 25-minute sequences, one centered on sight, one on touch, and one on sound, reveal connections these workers have to the workplace, to the objects they produce, and to the social space of the factory. It's a composite portrait of both healthy and alienated labor. I've been very encouraged by the response to this first film. At many screenings, the conversations have been lengthy and extraordinary. It's something everyone wants to talk about. While here, I will continue to work on the second film in this series, thematically centered on the mass and the individual. I've begun this series filming at Otto Bock in Duderstadt, where thousands of prosthetic hands, feet, arms, and legs are produced daily for the world market. Who thought prosthetics would come up in 2 presentations tonight? From rural Africa to large international urban centers, from wooden feet to microprocessor-controlled knees. Each object produced at this factory must be individually custom-fitted, so by its very nature, the factory also produces the most advanced form of individualized mass production. These prosthetics are designed to be as invisible as possible, but what remains most unseen and unspoken are the causes for their proliferation. The landmines, wars, terrorist incidents, industrial and vehicular accidents that multiply yearly to make prosthetics a growth industry. I was well underway in planning for a second factory shoot soon after my arrival here to a denim factory in Lesotho that produces distressed jeans, a place where countless copies of a single, supposedly personal and individual object are made. But I've been set back a bit by an attempted coup on August 30th in Maseru, Lesotho's capital. I'm waiting to hear back from my contact in Cape Town about when the time might be right to return. In the meanwhile, I will be editing the prosthetics factory sequence and researching other interesting factories in the Netherlands, in Italy, and in Asia. Speaking of unstable objects, it's perhaps the moving image it is itself the most unstable during this technical turn. As we now view moving images on telephones, in public squares, in theaters, galleries, kiosks, as well as at home. While here, I'm interested in exploring gallery versions of these works, as the architectural and installation possibilities of these moving images are exciting to envision. So I'd like to invite you back for my presentation on November 20th, when we can share some of these images and places, and we can hopefully share a conversation as well about this exciting moment that we're all encountering individually. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Anthony McCall. I'm a visual artist. And in order to explain what it is I do, I thought I would try to ask you to create in your minds a little scenario. Let's imagine that this is a projection space. There's a screen and there's a projector. And the lights are going to come down and we're going to watch a film. And on the screen, we're going to see a white dot will appear at the very foot of the screen. And over half an hour, very slowly and very gradually, that dot will describe a circle, leaving a trail behind it. So at the end of 30 minutes, there is a single circle of light. Now, that's the end of the film. And now I want to run that film again. But this time, I'd like everyone to move from over here looking at that screen to up to the screen, to turn around and to face the projector. I'm also going to add into the atmosphere a little mist, a little haze, to create a kind of a sea mist. The lights go off again, we're going to watch it all over again. Now this time, that white dot at the foot of the screen is revealed to be a pencil of light that runs from the wall to the lens of the projector. And as the dot traces a circle on the screen, in three-dimensional space what's occurring is the coming into being of an enormous conical object made of light. So halfway through, 15 minutes into the film, we now have a big half cone of shimmering light filling the entire space. At the end of the 30 minutes, there is a complete cone, large-scale cone of light hanging there. What I've just described is a film that I made in 1973 called Line Describing a Cone. And it was the first of a series that I termed then a solid light film. Solid light pointing to the paradox that when you create a projected object made of planes of light in midair, your mind refuses to believe it's immaterial and treats it almost as if it's a wall or a membrane that has to be treated with great respect. And the very least you might do is to reach out and touch it. The important thing I have two comments to make about this screening we've just shared. One is that in the first screening, when we were looking at the screen itself, we were watching. You watch movies, you watch games of soccer, and so on. But the second one, which was an object, required a different kind of looking, which I would describe as sculptural looking, which requires you to take your own body and move around the space in order to find out what kind of object it is and what shape it is. So to move to the left of it, to the right of it, underneath it, and even into it. And in fact, of course, as that cone was unfolding, it was also changing itself in relation to your body, because there was halfway through there was a concave side and a convex side, which then disappeared by the end. The second point I'd like to make about that film is that all of my later work, right up to the very present, though the pieces have become more and more complex, they're all solid light films, and they all share three things that that very first one, Line Describing a Cone, revealed. One, there is always a drawing present, a graphic line drawing at the very center of the installation or the projection. Secondly, there is always a sculptural object in three-dimensional space. And thirdly, there is a cinematic structure. I've actually been fortunate to show many of these pieces in Berlin over the years. Some of you may have seen an exhibition I did at the Hamburger Bahnhof in 2012, which was called 5 Minutes of Pure Sculpture, where we took the historic hall, darkened it, and had 7 large installations occupying the entire space. And I've shown a number of times with my gallery here, Sprutmalgers, and in fact the most recent show was last year when we did an exhibition of the early works from the 1970s, the early solid light works. Finally, one comment. Most of the pieces that I've made, including Line Describing a Cone, were silent, purely visual or sculptural. And in the last few years I've become quite interested in sound. And the project I'm really working on while I'm going to be in Berlin is to look at how sound might complicate or enrich the experience of the projected objects, the silent projected objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, good evening. I'm Mark Meadow. I'm an art historian from the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'd like to echo the thanks offered to the American Academy and to the staff for the warm welcome that we've all received, for, I have to say, the quickest and least intrusive set of orientations I've ever experienced in an institution like this, and especially for assuring us repeatedly that we're not the most difficult group of fellows that they've had at the Academy so far. Now, while I started my career as a more mainstream art historian, my first book, in fact, was on Peter Bruegel the Elder and on his Netherlandish Proverbs painting here in Berlin. Most recently, I've been working on the history and theory of museums and collections. My American Academy project, Quickeberg's Containers, Inventing Practical Knowledge in Early Modern Collections, is the culmination of one part of that research. The other side of the research is on modern universities and their material collections, and I'm also putting together a volume of collected essays about university collections at the moment. Now, I tend to think of my work as addressing very basic questions. And the one that lies at the heart of my current project is something which I have to admit puzzles me greatly, even though it doesn't really seem to puzzle very many other people. And that is, why do museums exist? I find the whole idea of having an entire class of institutions with specialized buildings and staffs and budgets and so forth that exist primarily for the sake of looking at things to be a truly bizarre idea. It's a delightful idea, and please don't get me wrong, I'm all for museums, but it's a bizarre one, that if it was something that didn't exist as yet, we can imagine somebody like Borges or Calvino inventing the idea of museums. For the historical part of my research, I can rephrase this question about why museums exist a bit more specifically, which is how and why did museums come to exist in the first place? To answer this, I'm looking at the very beginnings of museums in Europe at the Kunst- und Wunderkammern of 16th century Germany. These were enormous collections of the most diverse range of objects that you can imagine, which in their most grandiose forms were attempts to assemble in one place all possible knowledge of all possible things. Now that sounds very utopian unless you also think of what it is that modern research universities do, which is to attempt to know all possible things, all possible knowledge of all possible things. And I think the comparison is a good one because what I can now show is that these very early collections were every bit as much oriented towards knowledge production as are universities today. What I also argue is that it was not the great princes of Europe, the Habsburg emperors or the Wittelsbach dukes, who first developed this new kind of collection, but instead German merchant bankers, and especially the Fuggers of Augsburg, who were responsible for creating these collections. When princes did found their own Kunstkammern, about 40 years after the merchants began, they did so in imitation of the merchants and as an aspect of practical statecraft. As noted by Samuel Quickeberg, who is a physician from Antwerp, but who is working as a collection manager for Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria, Quickeberg wrote the earliest known treatise on museums. And what he states within this is that these collections were to help princes in developing new technologies and industries, in managing state religion, in furthering medical research, advancing military technology, and promoting trade and diplomatic relations. In other words, it was a part of administering the state. Now, looking at Kunst- und Wunderkammern in this way can teach us a lot about the many different functions that collections and the objects within them serve. One of the larger arguments I make in my work as a whole is that this has policy implications for thinking about museums and collections today. So in fact, the objects that exist in collections, whether in the 16th century or today, have many different kinds of value: market value, research value, sentimental value, political value, aesthetic value, teaching value, and that these values and uses continually change. In order really to understand what museums do and why they exist, we need better to understand the historical processes by which they are transformed. So for museums today, and I'm thinking here especially of university collections, which are in very real ways under a great deal of threat, my question instead becomes why and how should museums continue to exist? Thank you.
Allow me to read a short description of the work of Louisa Walker. Louisa Walker is a historian of Latin America and a scholar of capitalism. From Canada, she moved to the US to do a PhD at Yale University. For the past 10 years, she has lived in the US and Mexico. For her first book, the award-winning Waking from the Dream, Mexico's Middle Classes After 1968, Louisa used recently declassified secret police reports to analyze the everyday experience of economic crisis. She spent years reading government spy reports on customers in Mexico City's cafes gossiping about inflation, on clients in bank queues whispering rumors about peso devaluations, and on office workers on lunch break in taquerias joking about the government's economic policy. Her new project, the book that she is starting to write here at the American Academy, is about what happens when people cannot or will not pay their debt. We now know how central debt is to the history of capitalism, and Louisa asks, what happens when loans soured? In this new book called Economic Woes, Debt and the Ethics of Capitalism in Modern Mexico, Louisa is writing about the economic troubles of middle-class people. She has just finished a year of research in Mexico City, where she studied small claims disputes, bankruptcy proceedings, debates about usury, and the emergence of credit rating agencies. Partly inspired by the recent economic crisis and partly inspired by her own constant frustration with American Express's incomprehensible fine print, Louisa wants to understand the history of economic justice. She regrets that she cannot be here tonight. She's presenting her research at the University of Chicago. But since she is studying German, she has asked me to say, Danke für Ihr Kommen heute Abend. Ich hoffe, Sie ein andermal zu treffen.
Hello. I should say hello, y'all, because I come from the University of Texas, where Gary got his degree. I, too, want to thank everyone, those of you in the audience who have supported this institution, and those of you here and my fellows. So far, I've had the best conversations at any residential fellowship ever, and I've only been here 3 weeks out of the 5 years I've spent at them. I'm working on how medieval teachers used emotions, and particularly the emotions of women, to help boys learn Latin and respond to literature and to remember it all their lives. The first inspiration for this for me was the statement by St. Augustine that he remembered more than anything else the suicide of Queen Dido in Virgil's Aeneid, and that he wept for her when he was a boy. And I've never forgotten that image, and it's inspired me to work on medieval manuscripts of school texts. I work on the marginal notes and the interlinear notes of manuscripts of classical texts right now. Before this, I spent 20 years working on notes on a medieval rhetorical treatise, so I spend a lot of time thinking about how little notes in the margins can project a kind of feeling of the classroom. One of the things that's happened just so quickly here is that I've discovered a manuscript in the Staatsbibliothek in which some of the speeches by Dido, the woman that Augustine wept for, in which the glosses on them say, now she's speaking to him, now she turns to someone else. And one of the other aspects of what I'm working on is trying to determine how boys performed these speeches in the classroom, because we know that all classical texts and all medieval school texts were read aloud. Students rarely had their own copies, and so they memorized or performed as a group. And so all of learning of classical texts particularly was a group phenomenon, and it was one that was sometimes sung, that there are manuscripts in which Dido's speeches are accompanied by music. There are others in which they're accompanied by lots of little pointing hands and brackets and things that say, this is the most important part of the book. Now, my own interest in this partly comes from the fact that we moved every year when I was growing up, and I think I've had every kind of educational experience in the United States except a one-room schoolhouse. And one of the things that I've found, partly because of my own experience trying to figure out how to learn and how to respond and how to take in new information, is one of the things that got me into studying the history of learning and the history of what we remember and what matters to us from school. And I've also discovered that when I talk about this, it brings up memories in the audience. And I've learned a lot from talking to other people about the parts of their schooling and their history that they remember the most. So I'm hoping that some of you will share that with me sometime during my time here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Rosenberg. I study and teach history at the University of Oregon. And nobody has done the I'd like to thank the Academy joke, I think, but there it is. They said entertain. Open a good general newspaper on any given day, and you are likely to find one or more stories about the importance of something called data in our lives. Such stories are not clustered in the business section or the science section as they would have been even 10 years ago. To make the point in this company, I probably need only mention Marc Verstegen, trainer of Germany's World Cup soccer team. In interviews, Verstegen compares his data-driven approach to, quote, running an antivirus program on a computer. In its victory against France, the German team ran nearly 5 miles further than its opponent, the distance equivalent of having 12 players on the field rather than 11. In the press, this disparity was attributed to Verstegen's use of data analytics. Stories like these are everywhere, tied up with everything from love to art to health. We exercise with data, we find romance with it, we make political decisions with data, or perhaps we should make political decisions with data. One of the key stories in the election of Barack Obama was his effective application of big data analytics to the electoral process. Meanwhile, Obama's opponent in the last cycle, whose name I've been struggling to remember, proudly described himself as a data guy. We rarely think twice about the odd fact that a perfectly traditional name, a perfectly traditional thing like a name, mine is Dan, is now transformed into a paradigmatic element of what we call personal data. Claims about the ubiquity of data in our environment may be more or less accurate, but even as claims, they represent something powerful. The idea of data has become central to contemporary culture, to our understanding of our world and our understanding of our times. Of course, neither the idea of data nor the technical practices that support it are entirely new. In one way or another, we have inhabited data cultures since the first tax rolls were inscribed and the first populations counted. Yet the need to call data, data, to distinguish it from other sister concepts such as records, facts, information, or evidence is much newer. If we use the invention of the modern term data as an indicator, we might consider the 17th century as the beginning of our modern data era. Clearly, if data today is not what it was 10 years ago, then there will be a few more twists and turns in the story if we start telling it 400 years ago, as I will do in October. So 2 teasers for that evening. First, my approach itself is data-driven. In my talk, I will show how I apply a set of quantitative tools to unearth a hidden history. This kind of approach is becoming more and more common in the humanities, and part of my interest is in understanding its benefits and its pitfalls. Second, I will make a historian's argument. I will try to convince you that taking a longer view of the problem of data than is typical, a much longer view, may help us see contemporary problems in a new light.
First of all, many, many thanks for coming out tonight. It's actually quite humbling to see that so many people come out to hear what we have to work on and for supporting the Academy. I'm honored to be at the American Academy with my cohort. I too love Berlin. I'm usually here about 2 or 3 times a year. Ich habe einen Koffer in Berlin, as they say. I also want to say thanks to the staff, as many people have mentioned. They are absolutely phenomenal. In the 3 weeks I've been here, they've been able to tell me where I can watch my National Football League games at 2:30 in the morning, where I can go get my bourbon tasting, and perhaps most importantly, the best ways to get tickets to Berlin's 3 great operas and the Philharmonie, since I'm a huge fan of the music scene here in Berlin. I was a molecular biologist in a previous life until I was visited by 3 ghosts, and then decided to become a historian and philosopher of science, where I teach at New York University now. Previously, I worked on the triangular exchange among physicists, musicians, and musical instrument makers in 19th century Germany. Physicists assisted in the construction based on acoustical principles of organ pipes and of flutes, one thinks of Theobald Böhm. Musical instruments were also, for many physicists, scientific instruments, such as Helmholtz, who is a great pianist, used the piano as a scientific instrument to study natural phenomena such as summation tones and combination tones. Now I've totally changed gears. My current project at the Academy is what I was really trained in the sciences for. I'm working on gene patenting, as in DNA, not as in Levi's. Specifically, the impact on gene patents on subsequent work on diagnostics and therapeutics in biomedical research. It turned out I served as an expert witness for the American Civil Liberties Union and wrote an amicus curiae brief for the U.S. Supreme Court last year on the ruling of the breast cancer gene patents in the United States and the fallout that has had. So I'm interested in the role of a historian in public policy issues, since now I'm not working on 19th century dead people anymore. My decisions are actually read by more than 3 people, including my mom and my brother. So I'm honored to be the Bosch Fellow for Public Policy here. I'm also interested in the difference difference between the attitudes between the Europeans and the Americans on the issue of gene patenting. My work specifically deals with this one gene called CCR5. I use it as a heuristic tool to probe the boundaries between science and society. It turns out that the protein product, there won't be a lot of science, well, there will be a little bit at my talk, but not now. The protein product of that codes for a receptor that HIV recognizes. So it's a very important patent to have, and I'm interested in how that patent has affected HIV/AIDS research worldwide, because the patent also exists in Europe. There is an allele, a mutation called Delta 32. For those that are lucky enough to have 2 copies, one from mom and dad, you are by and large immune to AIDS. So biomedical researchers were very, very much interested in those who had this mutation. And it turns out there's a thing called allele frequency, which is the range of the mutation in different populations of the world. There's a huge range. If you come from the Baltic countries, you have an 18% chance of having the mutation. The mutation has not been found among Han Chinese nor among sub-Saharan African populations. So the second aspect of this project is about the rather controversial topic of race and genomics. Can one speak about race at the level of DNA? A number of molecular biologists in the United States say yes, most say no. What are the political and social ramifications if one can? And what if the same ramifications if one cannot? I'm also interested in the forces behind privileging race as a category of human diversity in the United States. There's a diverse range of actors in the story that have the same goal, but for very, very, very different reasons. On the one hand, you have the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes of Health, and grassroots movements who are interested in including more people in the healthcare in the United States versus big pharma, pharmaceutical companies, personal genomic companies that have rather different interests for proposing race as key for understanding human diversity. So in a sense, the historian comes out in me and says that a historian needs to show that there are alternatives. The fact that you can patent genes it's not inevitable that will foster research. It turns out not only is it not inevitable, it's actually not true. It actually hinders research in molecular biology. It's an interesting example of where patent law does not always foster research. And there are also innumerable ways in which you can understand human diversity. It doesn't necessarily need to be race. So using race as a category is neither natural nor is it inevitable, and I'm interested in understanding historically why that is in Europe and in the United States. Thank you very much for your time.
Exactly 1 year ago, I was a New American Academy Fellow myself, and much relieved at this point. Having to present your work or project in 3 minutes is always a challenge. I'm sure you have realized what an extraordinary group of fellows this class is. One of my class members from last year, Tara Sarah, just received the MacArthur Award. Tara has changed the way we view the concepts of nation, family, and ethnicity. Standing in this intellectual tradition, the current fellows make us think again, and refocus. Let us welcome them to Berlin with a big hand. I'm confident that the fall class of 2014 has whetted your appetite for individual conversations, not to mention the refreshments that we will be serving now. So thank you for coming out to the Academy. It is time to get up and mingle. Enjoy the rest of the evening.